Columns for the Super Nintendo. No, your eyes do not deceive you. This is Columns being played on an actual Super Nintendo via a multi-cart containing other Super Nintendo games. And apparently this is an actual release. Well, kind of. When I first saw this version of Columns on my multi-cart, I thought this was a bootleg version that some pirate group threw together, and if that were the case, then I'd be impressed by the quality of this port. As a matter of fact, I started recording this review under the assumption that it was indeed a bootleg. But after doing a little more research, it turns out that this is indeed an official port licensed by Sega to publisher Media Factory. Columns is essentially a Japanese-only release for the Nintendo Power flashcard service in 1999, where you could write games onto a special flashcard through special stations for a price. Now that's kind of a cool gimmick that I wish we had back in the day, but we didn't. That's why we have EverDrives today. But in any event, let's get on with Columns for the Super Famicom. So, for those who need a primer, again, Columns is a puzzle game where jewels would fall from the sky in columns of 3, and you have to clear them from the well by matching 3 of a kind in either a vertical column, a horizontal row, or a diagonal line. Your main means of control, besides moving the column of jewels, is shifting the order in which the jewels are stacked. There's no rotating bits for anything like that. Everything falls in columns of 3. The first couple of stages will give you hints on how to play, but you could skip ahead if you desire, and go for a higher challenge. You cycle the jewel order in your columns and you work with that. It's a fairly simple premise with some simplistic controls, but one that ramps up in the challenge level rather quickly due to the fluctuating speed and things of that nature. Performing chains and massive clearings is often key to survival in columns, and can sometimes happen by accident unless you're really good, in which case you'll plan for said clearings. And I know I just recycled that last bit from the previous video, but you know what? It's Columns. It's my 5th or 6th Columns at this point. I lost count. I'm not saying anything new or different at this point, other than this is an official version of Columns on Sega's rival 16-bit competition, which boggles the mind. And in that regard, it's a perfectly functional conversion of Columns with a pretty standard arcade mode, even though they call it an original mode, which isn't entirely accurate, but in any event. And you also have a versus mode where you can play against another player, or play in a story mode of sorts, competing against other computer opponents. There's also an option screen that lets you toggle the settings, as well as a tutorial that shows you how to play the game. Other than that, there's not much else I could say about this one. Control-wise, it's functional for a game like this. Columns gameplay more or less follows what's been established in official iterations, and all things considered, this is a perfectly functional iteration of Columns. And the inclusion of a versus mode against the CPU is a nice little addition for those who are into that sort of thing. Graphically speaking, Columns looks like Columns. Other than maybe deeper colors, there doesn't seem to be much of a difference in terms of the standard visuals between this official Super Famicom release and the Genesis version, which is the version I'm most familiar with outside of the 8-bit offerings. The only real new elements to take into consideration are the character portraits for the versus mode, which look like cartoon characters with thick lines. No further comment in that regard, I'm afraid. Sound-wise, you have the classic Clothos theme that's been retained and sounds pretty decent on the Super Family Computer sound hardware stuff. There's a couple other background tunes you could play in the background that you could choose from in the options menu that sound unique and probably not like any of the default Columns tunes that I've heard in the other games, but they're okay, I guess. Nothing special or memorable. The sound effects are alright, not much else to add there. Not much to say in terms of the sound department. It's okay for the most part. That's all I got. Sorry. Overall, Columns for Super Famicom is, well, it's Columns for Super Famicom, and it's done fairly well for what's essentially a game intended for release onto a flashcard burning service. Perhaps that's the one tragedy about this version, is that it never got a proper cartridge release, and as such, outside of the service that it was made for that's long since shut down, your only means of playing Columns on Super Famicom would be through emulation, or the aforementioned multicart that I mentioned earlier in this video, that the game was included on. All things considered, the novelty of this version of Columns is that it's on the Super Famicom, and not much more than that. Generally speaking, the Sega Genesis version of Columns that's more easily available should fill your needs for Columns just fine, but as far as this version goes, it's alright. Might be worth a playthrough if you're into the novelty sort of thing, but other than that, nothing special.